Hi everyone, I'm Adam Dede and welcome to Neurojournal Club. First, some shopkeeping. If you've been liking these videos, please go ahead and subscribe, and also click the link below to support me on Patreon. And if you like this video, go ahead and hit the thumbs up. So in the last couple of videos, we've been asking the question, can meditation improve your attention? And we're going to go ahead and keep asking that same question today, but we're going to try and take a look at what is the brain doing a little bit. So first, if you haven't seen the last couple videos, you might ask, how can we measure attention? And the answer is the attentional blink. Now, of course, there are many different ways to measure attention, but just here in particular, we're going to be taking a look at the attentional blink experimental paradigm. So what is the attentional blink? So in the case of the Slagter, Lutz, and Davidson study that we're going to be taking a look at today, and this is a pretty typical attentional blink paradigm, participants were shown a stream of letters. So here we have M, J, R, K, and so forth. And then intermixed within that stream of letters, you have a number. Here, 3, designated as T1 or target 1. And then there are a few more letters, and then there's a 9 here designated as target 2. And so the participant's task at the end of this stream of letters and numbers is to say what was the first number, and then what was the second number. And this turns out to be a rather difficult thing to do because the letters are being flashed so very quickly. In this case, each letter is on screen for only 50 milliseconds, so it's 0.05 seconds. Super, super fast. And then there's a 34 millisecond gap between each letter or number, as the case may be. So one question that we had for the future after taking a look at the results from this study before was, what is the brain doing? And we're going to try and get into that today, but first let me just quickly review for you what happened behaviorally in this study. So, who to study? They looked at meditators before and after a 3-month Vipassana retreat. So just keep in mind, that's just the same thing day after day after day for 3 months. So this is a really pretty intense thing that these meditators are doing. And then they looked at non-meditators just before and after a 3-month period. So the non-meditator controls didn't really do anything. They just kind of had 3 months of their life go by. And the results here were that when there was a short lag between the first number and the second number, so this is when you would think it's going to be most difficult because there's not a lot of time to process that first target before the second target comes at you. And during this short lag, we can see that both the novices and the meditators at the initial test were at about 60% accurate in identifying the second number, keeping in mind again that that second number, that's the real challenge. And then at the 3-month test, what we can see is that the meditators improved and are now up here at 80%, where the novices are at 70%. So we have this bigger improvement in the meditators. And then at the long lag, we see smaller improvements for both groups. And just to quantify it, we see the meditators improving by 20% in that short lag condition across the 3 months, where across all the other conditions and groups, we have a roughly 10% gain. So something's going on here that with meditation, the individuals are getting better at being able to detect that second number, even when it comes very shortly after the first number. So what's the brain doing? So attention's really complicated. There are several different ways in which the brain could be improving its ability to be able to see that second number. So what are some possibilities? So we could have better T1 processing, better processing of that first number. And this would kind of be like as things are coming at the brain, it's just shrugging them off, it has something happen and doesn't get too attached to it, just lets it go right on by. And in that way, it's ready to process whatever the next thing is that comes at it. We could have better T2 detection, so better detection of that second number. And what this would be is just kind of the brain is staying extremely vigilant, super aware, just constant sustained attention. And by having this sustained attention, you have the better ability to be able to see the second number. Or the third possibility that I'll bring up here is that there could be more capacity for T2. And that just kind of be like you're getting better at multitasking. So even if the brain is absorbed processing T1, the first number, it may still have some extra capacity to be able to process T2, the second number. Okay, so in this study they're going to utilize electroencephalogram, which is electrodes placed on the outside of the scalp. In this figure, we can see the electrodes placed on the outside of the head, labeled here, and the brain, in case you were unaware, inside the head. Each of these electrodes will then produce a squiggly line, which represents the voltage measured at that electrode across time, and that forms the raw data that can go into many different types of analyses. The type of analysis that's going to be used in the study that we're looking at today is called event-related potentials, or ERPs. The idea with an ERP is that you pick some event of interest that happens regularly throughout your experimental task, and then you average together a bunch of EEG recordings from around that event. In this example, we can see that there's some event, we don't know what, doesn't matter, happening at time 0, and we've got 10 examples of what the EEG looked like in the 1 second following that event. And you can't really see too much in the individual squiggles, but when we average them all together, you can see that there's a bump going on at about 200 milliseconds after the event. And that may or may not have meaning depending on what the question is that this experiment was set up to answer. Now today we're going to be looking at a bump that occurs at about 300 milliseconds after the event. This bump is called the P300, positive going 300 milliseconds after event. And here we have an example of an oddball discrimination task, which is kind of one of the classic tasks that's been used to detect a P300 ERP. And in an oddball discrimination task, a participant will see standard stimuli, here represented by S, that are occasionally interrupted by a target stimulus, here represented by T, and when the target occurs, the participant's task is just to press some button to report that he or she has seen the target stimulus. Now, in the ERP, over on the right, the event-related potential, the bolder, taller line is the representation of what the brain does when you have a target, and the shallower, thin line is a representation of what the brain does when you have a standard stimulus. And then to make this just a little bit more complicated, there are oddball discrimination tasks that use 3 stimuli, called a 3-stimulus task, very creative naming. And in the 3-stimulus task, the only difference is that sometimes there's a target, just as there was before, but sometimes there's a distractor stimulus, and the distractor stimulus is deliberately designed to be quite similar, but not the same, as the target. This creates an extra perceptual challenge for the participant, because they can't just mindlessly say, oh, anything that's not the standard stimulus, that's it, I saw it. They have to really look at what is the non-standard stimulus that has occurred, and is it actually the target, or is it the distractor? And in this situation, we get an interesting ERP. For the distractor stimulus, this dotted line ERP occurs, and it's called the P3A. So we can see that it's happening at about the 300 millisecond mark, but it falls off very, very quickly. And then when a target stimulus occurs, we get something called a P3B. And this is something that happens a little bit later. It's occurring, really peaking around 400 milliseconds rather than 300 milliseconds, and it lasts for a little bit longer. It's kind of flatter and not as tall. So here today we're going to be talking about the P3B effect. Now the P3B is thought to be something involved in kind of consciously registering a stimulus and identifying what it is. And you can imagine that that's exactly what you need to do in the attentional blink paradigm. You have to consciously recognize, oh, this is a number, and it is the number 3, or whatever it happens to be. Okay, so let's take a look at what Slagter, Davidson, and Lutz found when they looked at the P3B in relation to meditation in the attentional blink paradigm. So first, let's take a look at the ERPs that were collected from novices, so non-meditators, at the initial test. And here, the vertical line represents the time point at which T1, the first number, is presented to the participant. And we're looking at blink trials and no blink trials. So a blink trial is where the participant failed to see the second number. And a no blink trial is where the participant successfully identified the second number. And what we can see here is that there's really no difference between the two. We're looking here, this bump here is occurring from 400 to 600 milliseconds. Sorry, I don't have a scale on here, but just trust me, it's occurring from 400 to 600 milliseconds. And what you can see is that there's really no difference in the blink versus the no blink, this bump here being the P3B. So then let's take a look after 3 months. Did the novices change? Well, no, not really. We see that same bump again, so we have a consistent ERP being measured across the 3-month period, but we don't see any change in the amplitude or the timing of that ERP. So let's take a look at the meditators now. So what we can see here is that at the initial test, the meditators, similar to the novices, show no difference between the blink and the no blink. And here in this group, we happen to be able to see a pretty defined P3B. Again, this is occurring from right about 400 milliseconds to right about 600 milliseconds. And it's definitely a P3B, but it definitely doesn't have any difference between the blink and the no blink trials. But then, after 3 months of meditation, we suddenly see a difference that we hadn't had there before. And in this case, we see that for blink trials, so that's where the participant fails to see the second number, there's a larger amplitude P3B. And in the no blink trials, that's where the participant successfully sees the second number, we see a smaller P3B amplitude. So what might this mean? Well, if the P3B is an indication of the brain taking in information and evaluating it in some way, then it seems like the brain taking in the information of the first number and evaluating it in these no-blink trials is requiring less effort or less activation, which might be the reason why these meditators end up not blinking. If you take less effort and less resources to process the first number, then it becomes easier to process the second number because you've just kind of let that first number go very, very quickly. And it turned out further when they looked at the data a little bit more closely on an individual level that the amount of change in that T1 elicited P3B amplitude across the time 2 versus time 1, so this is how much did the individual manage to reduce the amplitude of their P3B from the initial test to the test at 3 months out. And what we can see here on the x-axis is that this is being measured in microvolts. So we're looking at the voltage measurement from the EEG. And we can see that some people managed to reduce their P3B by as much as 4 microvolts. And for some people, the P3B actually increased by 2 or 2.5 microvolts. And then on the y-axis, we're taking a look at the percent T2 accuracy, time 2 versus time 1. So again, we're looking across that 3-month interval. Here, a larger number means that the participant got better at detecting the second number, so that's that T2 accuracy. And now if we take a look at the individual data points, we can see the meditators are the circles and the squares are the novices. And you can see that the meditators kind of cluster in this top left area. That's the area where they have a reduced P3B and an increased T2 accuracy. But what's interesting here is that the novices are still along this same line, this same linear regression line as the meditators. So it's not really that there's something special about meditation. It seems to be that anyone who happens to have a reduction in their P3B across time is also going to have an increase in their T2 accuracy. So there seems to be some kind of a relationship here where a reduction in P3B, so that's kind of this rough measure of how much effort the brain is putting into processing T1, that first target, some reduction in that effort seems to be related to an increase in how accurately the participants are identifying the second number. So that's pretty cool. So let's draw some conclusions. So the meditators became more efficient at processing T1. It wasn't that they became extra vigilant. It wasn't that they became better at multitasking, increased their capacity. It seems like they became more efficient at processing T1 out of those 3 possibilities we talked about before. So the meditators spent less time and effort processing stimuli. Now, what are the limitations in this study? So ERPs, event-related potentials, average out a lot of variability. And it might be the case that there's some differences going on trial to trial that might be interesting. So what about oscillatory phenomena? ERPs are only one way to look at brain activity, and it turns out that they may not always be the best. The brain doesn't only trade in impulses of activity at particular times, these positive going waves or negative going waves. Instead, the brain has steady state oscillations that seem to occur and act as ways to form linkages between different areas of the brain through coherence. Now, that's a lot of stuff that I just threw at you, but just in general, keep in mind the brain has many different modes of communication. ERPs are only one of them. And then where in the brain. So we don't really have, I didn't really tell you anything about where in the brain this is occurring, and that was deliberate because with ERPs, measurements taken from outside the head, it's really, really hard to have any strong insight about exactly what parts of the brain might be generating this signal. So that's something that will have to remain for future research. So just to loop back to the conclusions, meditators automatically used less resources processing stimuli, and that seems to be part of how they've changed the way they interact with the world on this moment-to-moment way, processing what comes in. And then lastly, questions for the future. What does the steady state of a meditator's brain look like? So here we're looking at meditators' brains when they're doing something other than meditation, but what does their brain actually look like when they are meditating? And as we just mentioned, what about oscillations? And how does reduced T1 processing jive with theories of the attentional blink? So one thing to keep in mind here is that the novices showed no change in their T1 processing as measured by that P3B event-related potential. But they did improve in their detection of T2 across the 3-month period. So something else must be allowing them to improve besides this T1 processing. So there's multiple ways that you could get better at the attentional blink. So the question is then, how does T1 processing reduction jive with other theories of attentional blink processing? Is this a typical way that people get better at it, or is this something weirdly unique about meditation? What are the other factors by which someone might get better at attentional blink? So these are all things that will come to you in future videos, but for now, that's the video for today. Hope you liked it. If you did, go ahead and click the thumbs up. Please subscribe to my videos, and please support me on Patreon by clicking the link below. Cool. Thanks. Have a good one.